Hey everybody, welcome back to Backlog Banter. I'm your boy Abram, joined as usual by Tucker Hazel, and we're here today to talk about another ephemeral topic. We're here to discuss how games' legacies get formed and how they get challenged. And we have challenged you in our community.
A challenger approaches. Street Fighter reference. Street Fighter 6 comes out today as of recording.
We have challenged you guys to give us some games upon which your perspective has changed, so we can sort of have a larger conversation, not necessarily about any particular title, but instead the processes by which games sort of have reputations shift over time. But if you want to be one of the people submitting to our future videos, be sure to join our Discord link.
Submitting to us.
Submitting to us, yes.
Yes.
Be sure to join our Discord link as usual. Top of the description or down there. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell. I think that's everything.
We could actually do other things, but for today, we'll keep the light load. The load light.
We'll keep the light load.
We'll keep the light load.
Yeah.
You don't. You understand. It's video game time, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, I'm thinking it's video game time.
I'm thinking it's video game time, but I think everyone else is thinking it's video game time too, because well, we didn't get as many submissions for this as we did for our last video. I think that kind of tickled people's fancy a little bit stronger.
Yeah.
We did get quite a few submissions here, and this is such a sort of general topic that I'm really interested to break down like multiple sectors of this. Because I've got a few ideas for myself on games that I like more than I did when I initially played them, games that I like less than when I initially played them, and also just sort of generally, as I age and change my thoughts as a gamer and experience more games, looking back at other games, if they sort of meet the same heights or retroactively are as exciting as they were back in the day, which I think is the element of this conversation that most resonates with my mind.
Yeah, I think that the only other bit of preamble to give before we really get into
We the People,
in order for a more perfect union, are talking about video games today, and we are prompted to do such because
the work of Backlog Banter is an attempt to perform a more perfect union. What is it?
To create
with people
to create
in order
to establish, form,
establish,
justify, rectify, erect a more perfect.
I used to have the whole preamble thing memorized because of the Schoolhouse Rock.
Yeah.
The
point is,
anyway,
society has moved beyond the need for the preamble.
Still in a box somewhere.
Yeah. You know what else is in a box? Video games. They come in boxes. And we were talking about one in particular that's doing very, very well that you might even be playing while you're watching this video, and that is Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. And Tucker, you had posited, which I found very interesting, this idea of how soon can we say that a game is one of the greatest games of all time?
Yes.
And
yes.
I think
that's a topic that I think we can nail on a later date,
yeah.
like even more specifically, but it did certainly spur on this conversation.
Yeah, it's a different line of query, if you will. But
Happy Pride Month.
Happy Pride Month. It got me thinking about this idea for me that we need to give games time because in the discourse, in the sort of larger canon of games, things happen and come and shake up titles that maybe are either exceptionally well received at launch and then sort of lose some of that cachet, or are maybe overlooked and then
absolutely
reevaluated and reclaimed over time. So that's something that's really interesting to me because there's a number of games that I feel like I've really flip-flopped opinions on that I want to talk about. And I think we've gotten some really interesting ones from the audience that speak to some of the things I want to talk about. And I who's that with Bros? Because Bros actually ties into what I want to talk about.
He's always coming in there with the greatest
Shout
thoughts.
out.
His comment from one Brogan chatting. He says, "The game I'll use is Ninja Theory's DMC, Devil May Cry." I believe there's like a colon or it's like a subtitle.
Colon, yeah.
I think that for me, that was a big lesson in what expectations are and can be to color impressions of a game. Demanding a game be one thing without recognizing its ambitions on its own is really important. Basically, it was a Western outsourced, parentheses, in the time when Capcom outsourcing was really a problem, end parentheses, project in a franchise for action fans. A person wanting the next Devil May Cry was sorely disappointed, and the reboot interpretations also deliberately ignored or pushed back against story staples. People trashed the game. But over time, the definitive edition came out and addressed the core issues. The Virgil DLC was so good, it informed later versions of the character, and as the franchise took shape, DMC found its own place in my heart. It's a game that tried to have really cool art direction and a social message, and went for different concepts of cool. It still isn't the best game ever, but playing DMC5, I think it's very clear DMC Reboot was a major influence on it. DMC5 took the best of every game before it, and art direction and the urban landscape were huge lessons.
Yeah, I
DMC fan number 1, Abram Bunner. Give me your thoughts on DMC, a game you have not played.
Right, DMC fan number 1 who has played about half the series and likes exactly one game from it. A lot, though. I think DMC5 is an amazing game. What Bro is speaking to here is, for me, one of the major through lines in this conversation, in that sometimes it takes a new game to illustrate the potential of the one that came before.
Yeah, definitely.
And this is a theme that I think, from a Nintendo perspective, has been recurrent across many of their largest franchises.
Sure.
I think Wind Waker is an exceptional example.
Oh, great. Yeah. That I have heard so much recently. I don't even know where, what content I've been consuming that's been referencing Wind Waker at its, origin, but how Wind Waker, if you are in the gaming consciousness, general zeitgeist, you'll know that Wind Waker was the kiddie Zelda game, and oh my god, Nintendo's abandoning the hardcore fans, and what is this shit, pastel color palette, and Link's a child now, and we want hardcore, realistic, gritty things, like the tech demo they did for the GameCube.
Yeah.
I mean, also, I just found out yesterday, they did a similar tech demo for the Wii U that was a gritty, realistic Zelda, and then they did Breath of the Wild, which did not get the same kind of hatred, even though it is a more cartoony visually game, but Wind Waker now, and since I became a fan of video games and started hearing about them, Wind Waker is one of the all-time praised Zeldas. And so looking back and hearing that people were very disappointed in it, not only when it was announced, but even sort of when it came out, is, I think, one of the prime examples of people being like, hold on, what were we smoking back then?
Yeah, it's interesting because you read about the demos. I believe it was the 2000 Space World demo.
Yeah, Space World, yes.
Showed essentially the Ocarina of Time art direction brought up to a GameCube standard. Sort of the way Link looked in Melee, for instance. Mm-hmm. Obviously, Wind Waker wasn't that, and Wind Waker ended up getting sort of pejoratively referred to as Zelda by people, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
I have Wind Waker on the brain because I've been writing about it recently. And what's interesting about this example is that obviously Twilight Princess not only gave people what they wanted for Wind Waker initially, but it also kind of showed that Wind Waker informed what Twilight Princess became in part. I really do think...
Oh, definitely. And I believe that's been talked about by Al Newman and other members of the Zelda team who are like, we needed to correct course, quote unquote, because people were so upset at the time with Wind Waker that I think they wanted to still do more cartoony things, but they were like, we have to make this much grittier. And Twilight Princess is visually certainly the most realistic, grounded, brown and gray Zelda game that we've seen.
Yeah, it's interesting because then obviously you also had shortly thereafter Phantom Hourglass. As not only one of the only direct sequels in the Zelda series, but also kind of a clear admittance that no, we're not done with Zelda yet.
Yeah, and Toon Link's style is actually the most pervasive and consistent art style the Zelda series ever had. Most Zelda art styles have only been used at max twice, and there's 5 Toon Link art style games. So it just goes to show, people hating it in the moment doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to stick around, and who the fuck cares anymore, you know?
Yeah, and it's an interesting one because obviously by the time I was playing Wind Waker, the public sentiment had already been engaging in the revisionism of we loved Wind Waker this whole time.
Yeah.
Which Colin Moriarty is often talks on asides in the podcast, bitch, I was there. You guys were hating on Wind Waker.
Yeah.
You're lying. And I think it is interesting, and it really does speak to, for me, the heart of this conversation, in that it takes a while for sort of the reputation of a game to form, in my opinion,
Yeah.
because Wind Waker now is that beloved game. It is for
Of
many
course. Yeah.
people, myself included, uh, the pinnacle or the favorite in the Zelda series.
Yeah.
But
And also, it's the one of the most clamored for current ports.
yeah,
People are like, "God damn, bring back Wind Waker HD."
and I think the whole notion of the revisionism around the sort of public love for Wind Waker is emblematic of just that, the idea that you releasing your game is not necessarily where the conversation ends. It
Yeah.
takes time for things to sort of shake out, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, I think so. I actually have a very close time wise example for what we're talking about in this conversation, which is a video I watched just I think yesterday. Called and I found it on my phone. I was like digging through, like, what the hell do I need to search to find this? It's a good game, but a bad blank game.
Oh
And
yeah,
so it was talking about the idea of games in established series messing up the formula, doing a different thing, and then people be like, okay, it would have been a good game on its own, but because it steps so far away from what the series was before, is it really a good example of what the series
yeah,
does? And Wind Waker was, no, not Wind Waker. I guess they were talking more about Breath of the Wild, sort of
that's a big
bucking
one.
series
Yeah,
conventions, which with Tears of the Kingdom has sort of been a revamped conversation of people being like, are we really gone from like the more linear dungeon style games that dominated Zelda for most of its history and most of games history at this point? And other examples that he brought up, and what reminded me of this was DMC Devil May Cry, which is not a game I have any experience with, but the only thing I've heard is that it's the black sheep of the franchise. People upset they used
yeah,
the black haired Dante in PlayStation All Stars, and that's a weird thing that I can't connect to personally. But even for examples like Breath of the Wild, which revamps series conventions, or another one that they talked about in their Resident Evil 4, which obviously bucked series
right.
conventions and was to the benefit of that franchise, but did actually have naysayers at the time, which is not something I guess I could have like surmised. But that is a game that is so revered now that
Right.
it sounds ridiculous to think back and people like, where are the cool hallways and puzzles of older Resident Evil titles? Like, no, Resident Evil 4 is one of the greatest games of all time. So like, um, but for me, I don't have enough examples of that on like a very personal level where I've been
Sure.
playing a franchise long enough that having its series conventions bucked, or in the case of DMC, sort of trashed upon, as Bro was saying, that I am mostly in the place of the series that I'm loving now are in the place that they are now as of 7 to 10 years ago. And so it hasn't been a long enough time to be like, okay, we got to try something new. And then, so I'm currently in an area where I feel safe in a lot of these things.
Yeah.
Even with Zelda, Breath of the Wild was the first Zelda game I really got into. And frankly, it colors my opinions looking back. Trying something like Ocarina of Time, like, I just want the freedom of Breath of the Wild, because that's what Zelda is to me. And I think
Sure.
the conversation around this that we're having of your thoughts on a game changing over time, or the thoughts on a game changing over time, I think it's also important to recognize that as new waves of fans come in, the definition of what a series is, or what a game should be seen as in the general consciousness of the gaming world, shifts as more thoughts are brought in and people with different experiences. Like, more people have played Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom than any other Zelda game.
Yeah.
And so now Zelda is that to most people that have played Zelda. And so it's just shifting over time. And I think that's really, really fascinating. And you're right that that's not something we can ever pin down in the moment. You have to have the hindsight to be 15 years or more after Wind Waker came out and be like, wasn't that weird back then? But you got to have the time away from that in order to like make those sort of claims and talk about them.
Yeah, and I think as we're talking about in the some of these big Nintendo examples we're giving, it's not necessarily that the quality was ever even contested.
True.
There was Resident Evil is another great example.
Yeah.
The issue there was more sort of ideological, I guess. I can't think.
Yeah.
I can't
No, I
think
think
of.
it's
Yeah, I
true.
can't think of a better word for it than that off the top of my head right now. But in that, we're moving.
It's a contradiction with traditionalism.
Sure. And it's an interesting idea, I think, because I often think about the NES era, wherein the notion of a sequel
Yeah.
was so broad.
Yeah. It was very nebulous.
Yeah, I mean, you look at so many franchises obviously Mario stateside, but Zelda again. It feels like we're always talking about Zelda, but Zelda's
Mm-hmm.
one of the clearest examples of this. Of like
Mm-hmm.
Adventure of Link, what does that really share in common with the first title? Well, it
Yeah.
shares a lot of sort of larger, more ephemeral ideas of what makes Zelda, but not maybe necessarily the same gameplay tenets. And it feels like sometimes we get in a place of conversation wherein like the replication of gameplay tenets is what's more and more important for people now.
Yeah.
Maybe it's
Mm.
because obviously franchises at this point have had so much more time to develop that
Yeah.
people get sort of set into these routines.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. And even with
yeah,
Zelda, when we're talking about from the very beginning, it's sort of been like, what is the identity of this franchise?
yeah,
That was only in question for the NES era, because then
right,
you hit Link to the Past and Link's Awakening, and those games are very similar. And then the Oracle
yeah,
games, and even when you transition to 3D, it's a natural progression in terms of, okay, if you're going to 3Dify Link to the Past and make it a little more open, that's going to end up with Ocarina of Time. And for Zelda, really, for the first time since Zelda 2, which no one really talks about how that was a breaking of that chain, because it's sort of the black sheep at the bottom of discussion. But Breath of the Wild is the first time we really are feeling that conversation in the modern time of it is very different structurally, and there are fans that feel sort of left behind, or like their needs or wants for the Zelda formula aren't being served. But on the creative side, Aonuma is happier than ever with what they're doing for Zelda, and I think it's very interesting to sort of put that in conversation with comparing it to like NES era Mario 2, Zelda 2, Castlevania 2, where it's like, it has the same name on the box.
yeah.
There might be the same guy in there, but otherwise, who the hell knows?
Yeah, I think there is sort of this notion of alienation, as we're saying over time. Of well, if you do the same thing enough times, and then you start to pivot, well, you've built up a sort of tolerance for gameplay style. Another one I want to talk about that I think is kind of interesting is Halo. My fucking light, my light sometimes it just disagrees with me. How about that? That's
Yeah,
nice.
that's fine. Yeah,
Um, Halo is interesting because this is a case wherein we look at Zelda, it's the same Zelda team making a
yeah,
series of creative decisions that, in the case of Breath of the Wild, just take them a similar group of people away
yeah.
from what they were doing before. Um,
Mm-hmm.
in the case of something like Halo, and actually it exactly tracks what Bro is saying with DMC. You take a
Yeah.
franchise and you give it to somebody else entirely.
Mm-hmm.
What
Yeah.
happens then, right?
Yeah.
In the case of Halo, you get Halo 4, which is a game that has a very interesting sort of place in people's hearts as, oh, it was the one that began to introduce, well, Reach really did, but more so than Reach, sort of standardize this more Call of Duty set of sensibilities around the
Yeah.
gameplay of Halo, and people disliking that. And I don't think that the 343 games are really any closer to being reevaluated, you could say. However, you
Yeah.
will find a lot of people nowadays saying that Halo 4 has one of the best stories in the series.
Yeah. Yeah.
Eh,
I do think that that reevaluation is coming.
Yeah.
But that will have to happen with people who grew up with 343's Halo games, and then that's what they have nostalgia for Halo, which that is an up and coming group of people. But it's not the dominant force in that discussion sphere.
Maybe, but I also think it would just. I do think that Halo Infinite being so much more sort of emulative of what Bungie did
Sure.
kind
Oh,
of
sure.
does make what 343 did in 4 and 5, even though I think
Yeah.
Infinite's the best of those three games, make
Mm-hmm.
at least what they did there more distinct. And
Sure.
the reason I don't necessarily think you need a new generation of fans to come in and do that labor is I think about our, for legal purposes, person that we have no feelings on any which way, Josh Thomas, his opinion on Super Mario 3D World to be quite
Yeah.
interesting because he's one of the many people who revisited 3D World in a
Mm.
post Odyssey environment and had a much more positive
Yeah.
opinion of it.
Yeah.
Donkey did a similar thing with Captain Toad Treasure Tracker in his video about that, saying, well, this wasn't what I wanted. I wasn't really paying attention to it at the time during the Wii U era. I was disappointed for
Mm.
it for X,
Mm.
Y, or Z reason. Then we got the thing I wanted, and now
Yeah.
I can appreciate the thing we got in the meantime in a different way. And so
Hmm.
I think that's another key component of it too. I don't necessarily think you need to just sort of strong arm the people out of the way by being younger
Yeah.
and not having the reverence for the old thing. Sometimes you just do need to circle back.
Sure, definitely,
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah, and that's not something that I've ever really had the chance to do. There aren't many games that I didn't like that I played 5 or 10 years ago
Right.
that I've revisited in a substantial way and had the chance to sort of reevaluate in that regard. But there are games, if we want to get into specifics, that I did like more or less when I first played
Yeah.
them, and then since have changed over time. I think the prime example for me, and frankly one of the very few that I end up giving a second chance and end up loving, is Bloodborne.
Sure.
When I got my PS4, my dad took me to GameStop and he's like, "Yeah, get a couple games." And I went to the clearance section and I'm like, "What's the cheapest? What can I get?" I got Ratchet and Clank on PS4 and I got Bloodborne. And I actually didn't play either of those games until like many years later.
Yeah.
But with Bloodborne, I tried that game sort of as a joke with my friends when the first time I played it. Is I'm like, this is a game made by the Dark Souls developers, and we all know how hard Dark Souls is. Wouldn't it be funny if we played this game? We're not going to be good at it. We're not going to get anywhere. But
Sure.
it'd be really funny if we played this game. And I was right. We stayed up until like 2 a.m. just like stuck in the first area, getting killed over and over again. None of us had any experience with that gameplay philosophy or,
Yeah.
or the structure. I'm sort of like spending my blood echoes. What the hell is this? And dodging and parrying. Like I don't even know if I'd played like a real action game
Right.
at that point. So it was so foreign to me that I'm like, this is ridiculous. And for the longest time, I held the opinion that I would never even try Souls games because I was so against difficulty in games, and I disliked that design philosophy so much that I'm like, that's A, just not for me, but B, I kind of had a disdain for it because I was like,
Yeah.
these are the people that are trying to like force there to not be difficulty options in games, and everything's got to be hard now or else it's not good. And I was strongly against that. But when I did end up giving Bloodborne a second chance because my friend Joe is really into Souls games, and he was like, "You should give it another try. I'll help you
Yeah.
if you want. Like, I'll jump in and co-op with you and take down some bosses." And he did. But also, I believe it was in 2020 when Kind of Funny was doing a Bloodborne revisit, and some of them were playing it for the first time. I'm like, okay, I can have a conversation with other people experiencing it for the first time all these years later, and it gave me this in.
Yeah.
And I, learned how to be better at the game through learning it from other people. But B, for me, what was missing was a connection to that world
Sure.
that I did not have because I wasn't familiar with Souls games. And when I learned about the lore by watching Aegon of Astora and Vatividia and all this, I'm like, this is, Jesus Christ!
Right.
And then I played nothing but Bloodborne for like 2 months. And there's evidence of that on the old Backlog Banter channel because I didn't do anything but talk about Bloodborne when we were doing BLB
Yeah.
every week. And that's just like such a radical reinvention that frankly is the only example of that I have. But I know that more of those will probably come as I play more games and revisit older games. But I strongly disliked and was so against Souls games, and specifically Bloodborne because it's the only one I played. And then it's one of my top 15 favorite games I've ever played. And like,
Right.
I got sad when I finished it. I'm like, Jesus Christ, no one's doing it like FromSoft, which is, the general sentiment that From fans have. But yeah, it was a really interesting sort of redemption arc for me. And now I'm solidly a Souls fan. I played 3 of them, and they're 3 of the greatest games I've ever played. Do you have any examples like that, or any thoughts on my redemption story?
I actually want to go to the community for one sort of parallel. This comes from Nishquick, who says the following: "My experience changed with Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. Surprisingly, those who know me know I love Xenoblade as a series. It's my second favorite franchise in gaming. Definitive Edition took me a while to even pick up and start, but it was also one of the first JRPGs that had a very long story and very complex combat and gameplay. It was obviously it was honestly pretty unapproachable to me at first, and I don't blame people who don't want to play it for those reasons. I remember once I got my PS5, I took a massive break with Xenoblade because I wanted shorter Sony first-party experiences. Too bad there's not too many of those anymore. But in the back of my mind, I missed Xenoblade and eventually got back to it after beating some other games and realizing Persona was equally long, if not longer. And once I got back to it, everything clicked and it was smooth sailing. I loved the characters, world, story, music, combat, and it was perfect. It became one of my favorite games of all time. I guess I just needed to break myself into that JRPG mindset. Once I beat it, I was hesitant to start 2 because I heard a lot of quote unquote bad things about it. I eventually said, what the heck, and took the plunge. I'll just say it was a roller coaster of good and bad, and amazing and not so amazing. But my experience with DA made it so that I was able to power through Xenoblade 2 with hardly any breaks. I did because Metroid Dread release. Great game to take a break for. But after I beat 3 and experienced a fantastic ending, I looked back at my initial thoughts on Xenoblade and how I didn't really care for it and how I didn't really gel with it when I first started. But after 2 and leading up to 3, I saw myself as a super fan. I guess I just needed to get into the JRPG mindset. My breaks with DE really helped. Hope that
Yeah.
answers the question. It does answer the question. I think it speaks to exactly what you've been saying.
Absolutely. And this is you're right. This mirrors my experience with Bloodborne exactly because it's a different mindset of a different kind of game that either me with Souls games or Niche Quick with, I guess, JRPGs in this case, we're not familiar with, and you need not only to ease yourself into it, but I think for me it was the breaks between me trying Bloodborne, having some time to sort of reevaluate what I knew about FromSoft and game design and such, and then come back to it with a different mindset by being helped by other people, and in Niche Quick's case, just sort of thinking more about what they enjoyed out of JRPGs.
Yeah.
That allowed the two of us to have some of our favorite games of all time be ones that we didn't like when we first tried them.
Yeah, I think you need to step away, play more games, and then return to a game sometimes.
Yeah.
And as is interesting for me, sometimes it's not at all related games. I mean, Nishkook is talking about needing to be sort of eased into the JRPG a little bit, but I think about Metroid Prime as a good example for me of a game that I tried 2 or 3 times. I think before I even
I'm from the same.
Yeah. Well, before I even beat the game, then I've since beat it again with the remaster. But I distinctly remember when I was playing Prime for the first time. I think this sentiment might even also apply to Metroid Other M, which I had gotten a really, really cheap copy of during the time when I was going for like no money, and when I had no money, I was like, "Ooh, Nintendo game, right?" But the sort of sense of the sense and method of progression in Metroid of sort of careful observation and backtracking and sort of item collection, coupled with a quote-unquote darker aesthetic than the games I was playing a lot of at the time, sort of turned me off of Metroid. And I can't even really point to a specific game that I played that got me interested. Yeah. But I had played enough other games over time that when I had returned to Metroid, it was really the 2D games and then sort of into Prime. But something happened. And I think that speaks to the fact
a dark force.
A dark force.
I believe you were probably corrupted. I don't think it was a choice.
Corruption, Metroid reference.
Oh,
I think sometimes you just need to grow and experience other sorts of art and sort of new pathways that weren't there before get formed, and you become interested in things.
Neural links
that you weren't previously interested in. One for me that I chip away at, it feels like often, is Metal Gear. I really want to be more of a Metal Gear fan than I am. I'm really not one, to be honest. And Metal Gear is the sort of thing where I have tried, particularly Metal Gear 3, I've tried on several different instances.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. I think I probably tried Metal Gear Solid 3 like 3 times. Or 4 maybe, actually. And like, I feel like I get a little bit closer each time.
Yeah.
But something just has to click. And it's going to be random, but it's going to happen, I believe, because sometimes I can view a franchise and see, I'll be there one day. And I think it's part of why I really don't like how a lot of Nintendo fans just play Nintendo games. That's sort of a stigma that exists, which is sometimes fair, sometimes isn't, but you can sometimes see where people are like, oh, I want more to play, and then there only exists in one little pocket of the industry, or the Twitch streamers who only play FPS, and then say the industry is dying. Well, sometimes to reinvigorate your love of something or to find a way into a thing you want to love, you need to go elsewhere and return.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's what I love so much about the variety of games that I play. I don't. There's a good amount of games that I play that I'm not interested in. I
Yeah.
mean, I have played like 15 Kirby games that I didn't like. And there are plenty of games that are like historically important, diving into some of the random NES games that I've played. I mean, I played fucking Wave Race on Game Boy last year. Like a lot of these games that I end up trying, I don't expect to connect to, but I want to learn something from.
Yeah.
Whether that is their importance in games history because of the franchise or how it influenced the developer that made it or something. But not only that, like it gives me a distance from the things that I know I love in order to come back and find something similar but maybe slightly different that branches me off in another direction. And I think it's why I don't like playing similar games back to back.
Sure.
I put down Red Dead 2, which was, as I was playing it, one of the best games I'd ever played, because I knew that I would be getting Zelda and been getting very into Zelda imminently because the game was releasing and I wanted to get it when the game came out. And I was like, look, it's not fair to Red Dead 2, but I know that I will stop playing Red Dead when Zelda comes out and short shrift it in that way. So I'm going to preemptively cut myself short, hopefully return to it. I'd like to, but I don't want to impact Zelda because I'm playing two games that are very similar next to one another. And so then in between, I played a bunch of other random horse shit. And then I got back to another open world game and I was back in the mindset where I'm like, I'm not overwhelmed because I wasn't just playing an open world game 3 days ago. And then I experienced Tears of the Kingdom, and it's easily my current favorite game of the year. And I, continued down the line of like, I was in the right headspace for that. And it was because I told myself to take a break, try something else, and not have two things that are like similar bumping up next to one another.
Yeah, I think I think I want to say something completely different.
Perfect. Backlog banter, ladies and gentlemen.
Because I think we're getting into the sort of the particular interpersonal angle here, but for whatever reason, this is sort of linked a thought for me. It's sort of like a more global idea, and that's about the games that, because we're talking about this notion of finding your avenue in to something. I think often about Earthbound. Earthbound's such an interesting game to me, and it's a game that I've written extensively about, even though I'm really not a huge fan of it as a singular internal game. There's a lot that I love about it. I love the characters, I love the setting, but I have trouble with the gameplay. Just to clarify, because I know Bro is watching and Bro loves Mother. But what's so fascinating to me about Earthbound is that the game sold like shit.
Yeah.
It had no status at all. But what it did have, and it took a long time to have this, was a series of incredibly talented people who loved it.
Yeah.
Toby Fox being sort of preeminent among them. When Undertale comes out and other games like Lisa and Citizens of Earth and various things create, and Omori and all these games create the idea of the quirky Earthbound indie RPG, whatever, those games manage to bring Earthbound up with them. There's no doubt that something like Undertale is many magnitudes more beloved than Earthbound is, just on terms of how many people play and enjoy the game basis. But and I'm going to flex, Toby Fox has told me...
friend of the show. Communicator of the show.
Undertale would not exist without Earthbound. And I think that's a really interesting example of a game whose legacy was completely inverted. And I feel like largely because of the people who sort of by osmosis gave it the attention that it now has.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I know that for me, Earthbound is a series that I don't know if I will ever try to really get into. I do love Undertale, and I've played that game through twice, which is a rarity for me, playing through a game multiple times. But knowing the game's legacy and how it's influenced other things does make me appreciate it more on sort of a tertiary level, because I'm not interested in playing Earthbound, but I'm interested in playing games that are inspired by Earthbound. So by tangent, I'm interested in Earthbound. And I don't know how many other examples of games like that you can really point to that have been reevaluated or brought back up in that way. I'm sure there certainly are some, but Earthbound does feel very unique in
Yeah.
that sense, in that it is a direct corollary that was sort of risen from the dead because something that it inspired became 400 times more popular than that game ever could possibly think of being.
Yeah, I think there's other interesting ones like System Shock and System Shock 2 are
Sure.
by no means
Oh, that's a great
those
comparison.
are by no means obscure games at all.
Yeah.
But there was a period of time when they arguably were, when they really were
Mm-hmm.
not accessible. Um, but and obviously System Shock 2 is kind of where Ken Levine first sort of made it his name. But when BioShock came out, and
Mm-hmm.
BioShock was as big as it was and
Yeah,
is and will continue to be, that sort of rises the stock of System Shock, a game for which a lot
definitely.
was for a long time, and it might have been Ash Parrish writing the review about the new System Shock remake for Polygon or whatever. But whoever it was for Polygon was writing like about the period of time in which System Shock was sort of distributed as freeware. Um,
Yeah.
it's it's interesting how sort of sometimes a convergence of cultural factors like that, a really engaged community, a really important spiritually informed game, and
Mm-hmm.
even direct support like a remake, or in the case of Earthbound, that faded final virtual Wii U virtual console re-release and obviously
Mm-hmm.
Switch Online release. Sometimes it's these convergences of things that like muscle a game back into
Yeah.
the status of importance or like
I've got a
relevant.
very direct uh, reference to
Yeah.
that is sort of future projection, but I think this will make sense. I feel like a fucking sage right now.
Okay,
Okay,
let's hear it.
Marathon.
Yes, I wanted to say this too. I've got a lot to say about this.
Marathon
Yes.
is a game that I did not know existed
Yeah.
when Marathon
Well, that's because
was
you're
announced.
French.
Well, there's that. But I do consider myself someone who's pretty in tune
Yeah.
with not only games history, but the conversation around games and what games are influential and popular and are considered in these conversations and yada yada yada. I'd never even heard the name Marathon.
Yeah.
And so when Bungie announces Marathon, and my first thought is, holy shit, a new Bungie IP. Yeah, let's go. They haven't done that since Destiny in 2014. And then I was like, hold your horses, buddy. There's a trilogy of those old games from PC in the 90s. I'm like, huh? The fuck are you talking about? And frankly, I think that is because as someone who's uh, pretty in tune with these things, and I hadn't heard of it, these games are the original Marathon games aren't talked about in the same kind of reverent light that Bungie's later games, Halo and Destiny, are.
Yeah.
But now that the IP of Marathon is returned to the cultural consciousness and will only continue to become more and more popular as the fucking game releases and presumably does very well,
Yeah.
you found out that Marathon, or one of the old games, is available on Xbox, and some of these games are available even for free on PC. And so that game, I think, 10 years from now, will be reinvigorated, and people look back at it like, oh, I can see how this informed Halo and Destiny, and then returning to Marathon. And that's an IP that I will now consider and think about as part of Bungie's legacy that I never even knew existed because they were able to bring it back from the dead by that exact same team and with the exact same IP.
Yeah, I mean, so what's interesting, and a marathon is literally the next thing I want to talk about. So I'm so glad you
Yeah.
said that.
Yeah.
Marathon, I was aware of as being the previous franchise that Bungie worked on, that a
Yeah.
lot of Halo iconography and ideas are literally just ripped directly from.
Oh, sure. Interesting. I didn't know that.
Even things like the Spartan armor from Halo is also the Spartan
Yeah.
armor in Marathon and various things, but that's kind of where my understanding kind of ended.
Mm-hmm.
But Marathon, as it exists, the new Marathon game is not really related to the old ones. Well, we don't know
Yeah.
exactly what the
Yeah.
parameters are, but the art direction is sort of has echoes of the old Marathon games, but is extremely different.
Yeah. Yeah. Of
Obviously, this
course.
is now a PvP extraction shooter, so it's mechanically different too. But what it triggered was even people like myself who love Bungie but hadn't played those games, to want to go and play them, but also to resurface the work that Bungie had done that had just, I think, flown a little bit under the radar in like 2021,
Yeah.
where they aggregated and hosted and made readily available Marathon Durandal, and Marathon Infinity as freeware hosted.
These motherfuckers made a game called Durandal.
Yeah.
That's a crazy goddamn name.
And they're hosted
Donkey Kong.
through like one of Bungie's sites, and you can also
Yeah,
download a ton of like um, fan conversion mods and map packs and various things that fans put together there too.
sure.
So it's not that those games ever weren't accessible. It's not even that the marathon we're getting is like the direct marathon sequel that people are
Yeah.
waiting for, kind of like what Metroid Dread was to Fusion. But that
Hmm.
again, sometimes it just you need something that reinvigorates interest to go back and play older titles and have the opportunity to even want to form these fresh opinions about them. So I think Marathon's a really good
Yeah.
example of this.
No, absolutely. We have talked quite a bit about bringing games back from the dead and improving our opinions on it. But you know what? It's not the only way a game can be reconsidered over time. Sometimes games that you loved when you played them the first time, you go back and like, what the an opposite kind of what the fuck was I smoking that I liked that
Right.
when I played it initially. And my example that I'm going to start this conversation with, and I'd be interested to know if you have any examples of your own, is a game that I changed my thoughts on within my time playing the game. And so this is kind of a different example,
Yeah.
but I think it'd be fun to. It's really the only example I can sort of like draw to put my own hat in this ring.
Sure.
But a little game called Metopia is a game that I got when
Mhm.
it came to Switch, and when I started it up, I'm like, one of the best character creators I've ever seen. The idea of putting my friends in this RPG is so charming. The idea of it being sort of hands off and cyclical and interesting ways in this world design, I found incredibly interesting. I'm like, this might be one of my new favorite games.
Mhm.
And then that game went on for 40 hours, and by the end of the game, I don't like that game. I think that it has a strong base foundation, but because it's 40 hours long, I'm like, I think it's a bad game. And there aren't many examples of games that I've completely reevaluated like that. Of course, it is different. We're talking about a legacy of a game within the 2 month span that I played it. But I just thought it'd be interesting, sort of like to show that like on a smaller time scale, even from the beginning of the game to an end of a game, my thoughts completely 180'd. I think I might have even been talking to you, or I think I maybe had my friend Joe over,
Yeah.
that I was saying like, man, Metopia is awesome. This game is fantastic. I was trying to like sell Joe on that game. He's like, it looks kind of stupid. I'm like, no, dude, it's so cool. Oh, look what you can do. And then I notoriously do not like Metopia. Are there any game examples of games that you used to like and then now strongly dislike?
I don't.
I know thoughts are changing on No Way Home, but I'm trying sort of want to focus Ben on games.
um. Uh. I don't. I don't know. I think that. I don't know. I feel like there's more games that I end up revisiting and enjoying more than games that I revisit and like less. Frankly,
Okay, sure.
I want to have a think. I want to have a think about it. I
Yeah.
There's games that I definitely like less, but not to a radical degree.
Yeah, and that was definitely something that I was having trouble with looking through games that I've maybe lowered their score for on backlogged or like don't consider in my favorite games of all time anymore. There are a lot of games that I loved when I played them, and then I was sort of just like too high on them when I initially
Yeah,
played them, and then they just kind of like filtered into like the background of my knowledge. It's not that I dislike the games at all, but they've just sort of they don't jump out at me anymore, which I think is an interesting process of me choosing what games are my favorite is the ones that stick around with me,
Yeah.
the ones that I mentally reference consistently. There are plenty of great games that I played and loved when they came out, but because I don't reference them much in my mind anymore, I'm like, can I really consider this one of my favorite games if I haven't thought about it in months and months and months, at least compared to all these other games that I really do adore and continue to reference mentally?
yeah. I mean, there's. I think one of the ones that we have notoriously disagreed on
Mm-hmm.
a bunch is Super Mario Odyssey.
Sure.
That's definitely a game. I'm not going to say the P word.
What?
Pokemon. Is that what you're thinking I was going to talk about?
No, I didn't know what
Oh,
you were.
okay.
I thought maybe go like fucking I don't know Deathloop or something. I was in a totally other stratosphere.
No, I Odyssey is one of those games that I'm just sort of really intimately familiar with, and I've played so much, but I do feel like I
Yeah,
get clear just diminishing returns out of it.
sure.
And that I still think Odyssey is a very good game, but for my
Mhm.
sensibilities, it just the replay factor is not quite there for me.
Definitely.
And and
I
and
mean, you're wrong, but definitely.
and I think that's an important component of this sort of idea of the personal reevaluation of sort of
Mm.
what are you looking for? Because
Yeah.
I think this is one of the streets we differ on, wherein and we've had this exact conversation, right? So it's not worth relitigating in specifics, but whereas you wouldn't want to replay a game like Galaxy because it's more linear, I
Mm.
don't feel as strong of a desire to replay Odyssey because it's so loose.
Definitely.
Um,
Definitely.
and that's just a personal preference for me, and the sort of
Yeah.
thing that I couldn't have possibly known when I beat Odyssey and felt like it was near flawless back in 2017 and various things.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I needed time to settle into that. And by the opposite token, a platformer of the same year, Sonic Mania, I thought was really good back in
Yeah.
2017, but after gaining a much deeper appreciation for Sonic over in the
Yeah.
years that followed, and finding that to be such an amazingly, for me, replayable experience,
Mm.
now Sonic Mania is what I thought was a really good game before, to me is easily one of my favorite platformers. So
Yeah. Yeah.
part of the conversation also is just sort of what you're looking for in a
Mm-hmm.
game when you revisit it. Are you looking to have the experience you already had again? You're looking to have that deepen. You're looking to have a challenge. You're looking to have a different experience. I
Yeah.
think these are all sort of different aims, and they're going to inform how you personally feel about that reputation as it changes.
Yeah. Yeah. Do we have a comment in this vein that we can read out? Uh,
I don't.
Abby
Yeah,
says
just go for hobby.
something just decreasing his love for a game. He says, "For I think he's missing a
For
word.
me,
For
easy.
for me, I would have to say it would be Overwatch 2.
Yeah.
On release and even before that in the beta, I was having a lot of fun playing both alone and with friends. But with the result of a lack of meaningful content updates and besides the addition of a character or map, the game got stale. Especially because it does take some time to unlock characters if you don't buy the battle pass. Speaking of the battle pass, the progression seems more sluggish than other games like Fortnite and it didn't help me stay engaged in the game. Especially now with the cancellation of the hero mode, I don't find myself compelled to put time into playing the game."
This is actually a really, really good one because I think it speaks to a genre of play that I engage in much more than you do, which is sort of the live
Yeah.
service title. And I actually do have more examples of games along these lines that I've liked less.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
because this is one wherein the live service game, I feel that the legacy or sort of the reputation, I guess is a better word because I think it's too, you can't really, I don't know if you can really form your legacy as your game's coming out necessarily, but
I mean, I think you can because I mean, think about the life of a person. Their legacy changes over the course of their life. I mean, updates and doing new things in your life or slash the life of a game, I think does absolutely change its legacy. If you make a radical change like Overwatch 2 did, replacing the original game, that is within the development of that one game, but Overwatch 1's legacy is completely changed because of changes they made to that
yeah, that's
game.
true. But Overwatch 1 is also done. I think
Sure.
legacy is inherently a more retrospective term.
Sure.
But
Okay,
but
I
I
see what you're
think we're getting
saying.
too pedantic. The point is, we're just gonna
Yeah.
say the opinion of a game, which I think is a,
Yeah,
is a,
sure.
a more correct
That's fine.
one. A game like Halo Infinite, again,
Yeah.
um, I still think Halo Infinite is an exceptionally good foundation for a game. My
Yeah.
thoughts on the campaign haven't changed at all. In fact, because I
Mm-hmm.
sometimes do jump back into the Zeta Halo open world and I enjoy it just as much. But that's a clear example of, and it actually goes back to Bro's point about expectations too a little bit of the expectation upon a live service game is going to be one
Yeah.
of frequent updates that keeps the community
Yeah.
involved.
Yeah.
And it's no real controversial opinion to say that that's not what Halo Infinite's like. Almost said it. I'm gonna be careful about
Oh,
words.
opinion?
What Halo Infinite's reputation was sort of
Sure.
built upon. It
Yeah.
got the opposite reputation for updating infrequently. And
Mm-hmm.
as I said when the game was coming out, I want and hope Halo Infinite is a sort of game that I am playing every day for the perpetuity. And it was
Yeah.
that for a little while, and then the content updates right up. Now the game's getting a really big update on June 20th, which I'm really excited about. So I'll be back in it.
Mm-hmm.
but there's no doubt that my opinion on Halo Infinite on the whole was dampened by the fact that
Yeah,
the live service component wasn't up to par.
yeah.
Speaking of being up to par, I think that Mario Golf is another clear
Huh?
example. And frankly, a good number of Nintendo's, I hesitate to call them live services because I don't really think that's
Yeah,
what they are, but a lot of their games that rely on free updates have
yeah.
not sort of been where I think they should be. Splatoon 3 is even a good example. I think that
Mm.
those updates were too infrequent. Mario Maker, also Mario Maker 2, um,
Hmm.
brought World Maker too late. It
Yeah, yeah.
it didn't. There's a spot on the menu for another game style that never came,
True.
and those things like that, I think, are where I quickly and precipitously have my opinion on a game shift.
No,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and I think that is like the most direct example because we've been talking about games that are for the most part complete because they are single player
yeah,
games and maybe they'll get patches but or maybe DLC but that helps sort of reshift what the thought of a game is but with a live service game something like Overwatch, Halo Infinite, or the examples we're most intimately familiar with, Nintendo's games that do consistent updates, those can change drastically within a
yeah,
year and a half. I mean, you think about a game like Mario Tennis Aces or Kirby Star Allies, or even like Splatoon 1. These are games that were content bare when they launched, but because they were supported over the course of years, they're now looked back at as great games. And of course, those are there's a scale within those examples that I mentioned. But if a game is promised as live service and it is consistently updated, that is the expectation for one of those
yeah,
games, and those expectations can be exceeded. And you're like, oh my god, I can't believe they, are still adding fucking Dream Friends to Star Allies, and wow, this game has like a ton of goddamn Dream Friends, more than I expected, and so that ends up giving that game sort of a positive legacy by the end of its lifespan. But on a very subjective side, when I think about even the live service games that I have been big into, namely Overwatch and Splatoon 2, these are games, or actually even Minecraft, though that's kind of its own thing in terms of the amount of updates it's
yeah,
been delivering for as long as it has. But I never really had the chance for my thoughts on these games to change significantly because as a game player, I am very content with playing a game for a span of a couple months and then letting it drop to the wayside and not thinking about it again. And that's okay for me because I like to be moving on to the next thing. And my mind is not trained because of the way that I enjoy consuming games and experiencing them to stick around for the 2 years in which something is going to change dramatically. Or even with Overwatch 2, by the time that game was coming out, I think, yes, the fact that they're canceling the single player mode, I think, is the biggest problem with it because that's the only reason I was going to hop back into that game. But I wasn't disappointed with Overwatch 2 when it launched because I already wasn't invested in that game. Like, these are okay, whatever, a couple new characters, it's nighttime in Dorado now. Fucking, yeah, sure. Fine by me. But I didn't care about
right,
Overwatch at that point in time because I'd already gotten my fill of it. And so, even though Overwatch 2's legacy has definitely been dampened by
yeah.
what they've done to it. But on a very subjective level, I'm like, okay, I'm disappointed that I'm not going to get the hero mode, but it's just going to become a game I forget about, which is disappointing. But ultimately, it's kind of like a wash for me.
I mean, there's also good examples of games who completely change the narrative for the better through
Yeah,
their post-launch support. The one that is most important to me is definitely Star Wars Battlefront 2,
sure.
which was
No Man's Sky.
yeah, No Man's Sky too. I mean, No Man's Sky is one for me where I enjoyed the game for what it was when it came out, and I almost feel like it became way too complicated, at least
Sure.
for me. There
Yeah.
was something about the simplicity of Launch No Man's Sky that I really enjoyed, although I was certainly in the
Hmm.
minority there. But Battlefront 2 is an interesting one in that that game is very positively considered now,
Yeah.
100%. But it took a lot of work to get it there.
Hmm.
That's a game where I was there for it all. I was there for every update, with every new film that released when they're dropping new things or they're just dropping big updates in
Yeah.
general. And it's nice watching a community rally around a game as it's sort of radically overhauled for the better.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think
Definitely.
that's a really exciting position to be in. I'm unfortunately I'm not sure that those stories are as prevalent Um,
No, definitely not.
but even see it in the single player space, like Cyberpunk is certainly
Mm-hmm.
considered a lot higher, and considered to be
Yeah,
a lot higher
definitely,
regard
definitely.
now than it was before. Of course, Cyberpunk was great since it came out, but not everyone has sort of my third eye for these things. But
Exactly,
we
exactly.
have one more comment, Tucker.
Ooh, doggy dog.
This comes
Read it.
from Sith Scott, who said, "So one that is prevalent in my mind are the OG .hack games. I loved them when they were released, and in some regards I still do, but they aged like milk in their combat and traversal. You have to open up the menu 2 times to do one move, and there are no buttons to hotkey them. So if you aren't just doing the auto attacks, it becomes a bit of a chore. Also, the grinding in that game feels so annoying, since they expect you to grind on either side content or between quests, so it has a lot of
Mm-hmm.
random difficulty spikes, especially on that first solo dungeon mission. It still has some
Yeah.
fantastic characters, but doing it is a chore to play through when I want to. And this is the part that I'm interested in, because I have no fucking concept of what dot hack is, other than it's an
I was
anime.
about to look up the gameplay because I'm like, boy, I couldn't even fucking tell you what this game looks like.
No, but this last point,
Could be a visual novel as far as I know, but then you start talking about grinding. I'm like, I
I
kind of
believe it's
got
like
that.
a dungeon crawler type of situation.
Isn't everything that I don't know about?
Some PS2 games age well like Kingdom Hearts 2. Others, like the OG .hack games, definitely need a remake to be put into the current gamer era.
Yeah.
I think this is a really interesting point about the remake, but I almost feel like we need to have a whole separate conversation about remaking games.
Sure.
Well,
Sure. Yeah.
I think that there's a point to be taken here about just moving games to a different platform.
Yeah.
To me, KOTOR is the really clear example here. Of I tried playing KOTOR when I got my Series X, and I could get it all nice and polished up through back compat, but it just didn't work for me at all.
Mm-hmm.
And then I volunteered myself to review the Switch version for an Indie Fresh, and I was writing for them, and the simple platform change did a lot for my engagement, because I found that game
Oh,
was
interesting.
just served much better by a portable format.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's important too. Sometimes it just takes a really good port of a game to make people reconsider, not even a full remake.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. I don't know if I've ever experienced the game on that level, like changing platforms significantly, changing the way
Yeah,
that I experience it. I think that when I think about bigger games, longer games, even games like the Persona games that I have very little experience with, I've completed
yeah,
Persona 5, but I've never even tried any other ones. I do think that now that they have Switch ports, I am more likely to A, play them and B, enjoy them
yeah,
because of that portability factor. Um, but I don't know if there's many examples where I've actually gone and done that. I'm just like, oh, I'm more likely to play this now that it's available on Switch. And Switch is really the only example of a system powerful enough and not different enough like the DS and 3DS were, where it makes sense to port a lot of older games to this system, and they are in that same form factor, and then you can take them on the go. You can play Skyrim while you're shitting the forest, as I have. But for me, what this comment sort of brings up is the idea that taste and expectations change over
yeah,
time. Because what Scott was saying about the OG hack games, which again I don't know what those games are, but I can surmise, I guess, is that when he played them and when others played them initially, there were elements of those games that felt very normalized,
yeah,
and it's like, yeah, of course it's going to be this way. You know, some grinding, some weird combat. You didn't have any idea that there were different expectations for combat being different or the progression being changed. And for me, there are examples of franchises that have grown over time, or my expectations have grown over time as the industry has shifted, to where when I look backwards, I'm like, wow, I can't believe I really enjoyed that and the way that I did. And actually, I'm gonna say it. I'm gonna say the P word. Pokemon has changed significantly for me since this last few iterations of the game have reframed my love for Pokemon and where it comes from structure and where it comes from like the identity of the series, because I always loved Pokemon because I could be in this world and collect these creatures and learn about the lore and memorize all the fucking moves and the 900 goddamn little creatures. But what I realized after playing Legends Arceus and Scarlet and Violet is that I didn't love how those games were structured. I didn't love having to be stopped in the tall grass and be stopped by the trainers and be stopped by the environments in a way that Legends Arceus and Scarlet and Violet obviously have completely eschewed. And it made me appreciate what I liked about Pokemon and what I didn't like about Pokemon
Sure.
that I didn't even know I didn't like about Pokemon. I played 10 of those games for most of my life, and I adored every second of them, but I think about going back to even some of my favorite games all the time in Sun and Moon and X and Y, and I'm like, will I even like them anymore? And I had the same experience when I went back to Diamond and Pearl when Legends Arceus was coming out, and I was like, this is just slow, and I keep getting stopped, and I feel like I'm making no progress, and what the fuck, what's going on here? And it's because my expectations has been changed by the identity of the series shifting over the course of generations. Pokemon was that for the longest time, and now it's not. And now when I look back at what it was, I'm like, yeah, that's I think just not as interesting as it is now. And there are other examples that I want to get into of where I think this series or this discussion really started in comparing games and their sequels that I think improve upon them and lessen my opinion of the originals in retrospect, not because they're actually worse than they were, but because my expectations of what a game can do have changed by iterating upon them.
Yeah, I mean, what examples do you have? You want to chat?
Well, I think Tears of the Kingdom is the current
Yeah.
example of that, and where this conversation again started, as we referenced earlier, is that now that I have experienced the world of Breath of the Wild, that Hyrule, those characters, those physics, those mechanics, through the lens of having Ultra Hand and being able to build what I want and having Ascend and being able to go through the goddamn ceiling and rewind and fuse and all of this, when I think back to Breath of the Wild, which I've done consistently as I've been playing Tears of the Kingdom, I'm like, wow, that I don't find that as compelling. The lack of those things, if I were to go back and playing Breath of the Wild, sure, I loved that game for 5 or 6 years, and I still do. It's one of my favorite games of all time, but I don't know if I would have very much fun, because I'd be missing the elements that Tears of the Kingdom introduced, and I'm like, I just want to be able to fucking ascend. Or like, why can't I just like stick the trees together to make them go? It's like, that has completely reframed what I like about that duology of games, and then Zelda as sort of like a larger concept. That one of my favorite games of all time, one of the best games I've ever played, sort of looking back at it, I'm like, I'm not sure if I would enjoy that anymore, because it has been built upon in such substantial ways with Tears of the Kingdom.
Yeah, I mean, Tears of the Kingdom is a really interesting game in that it's sort of, by being so iterative, and that it's literally iterating upon the same engine and map and story and combat and mechanic set. Like, I do think that it probably obliterates Breath of the Wild. And I'm feeling that more as I sort of play Tears of the Kingdom. In part of, maybe this is just totally fundamentally better, but I wonder if there will also be something to say for sort of the simplicity of what Breath of the Wild offers.
Absolutely. And that's the only thing that's sort of a holdout to me, is I think like, okay, what does Breath of the Wild do better than Tears of the Kingdom? In my opinion, it's not very much, but the idea of that isolation, the loneliness, the breadth of the world, it being difficult to get from place to place, that is not the case in Tears of the Kingdom. I think Breath of the Wild still absolutely does that better, but it's a sort of a scales thing for me. It's like, okay, yeah, Breath of the Wild does do that better. I don't really care about that.
Right.
So for me, it doesn't put that above Tears of the Kingdom. But in terms of other examples, one of the, I think, the most quote unquote notorious examples, at least for you and me in terms of our conversation, is The Last of Us Part 2. A game that we both played, and in our review, one of the first videos we ever did together, I said that it made The Last of Us Part 1 look like a fucking crayon drawing, and that is a opinion that I've stood by in terms of how much more rich and detailed and interesting I find The Last of Us 2 compared to Last of Us Part 1, which at the time was one of my top 5 favorite games I've ever played in my life, and now it's like, I don't know, it's maybe like around 40 or 50, and like, I don't think about The Last of Us Part 1 very much anymore, because I think about The Last of Us 2 when I'm thinking about The Last of Us. And are there examples of sequels that you think have sort of reframed the way you think of earlier entries in that way?
We were talking about this in Discord too. I think they're very few and far between, and they're hyper iterative. Like Smash 4. There's no reason for me to play Smash 4.
Yeah.
I mean, there are, like, maybe I'd go back to Smash 3DS so I can play Smash Run and various things, but
you're not gonna do that.
But what I'm saying is that's maybe
no. I'm being jocular, Abram.
I love a little bit of jocularity. I have to say I take major issue with the Last of Us example after
Sure.
playing part one, and
Hmm.
because I was with you, I think,
Yeah.
but I think it's a reductive idea, especially having revisited part
Mm.
one.
Yeah. Which I have not done.
Right.
For context sake, I have not. I haven't played Last of Us One since I played it the first time
Yeah.
and loved it. 2016, 2015, maybe.
Yeah, and I think obviously there's so many new things coming out right now that it's really not feasible to do as much. But I really do implore you, I think, to go back to part one
Yeah.
because to bring the Breath of the Wild Tears of the Kingdom thing is still something I'm trying to work through because obviously you
Sure.
have finished Tears of the Kingdom. I've
I have.
played
Yes.
15.
95 hours,
Yeah,
baby.
I've played 15 hours, right? So
Yeah.
I'm still in the process of really defining my thoughts on that game and then how those thoughts differ from Breath of the Wild and how they're in conversation with each other. But there's no doubt that The Last of Us 1 is a much more straightforward narrative experience
Yeah.
than Last of Us Part 2. But I think I think it's inaccurate to say that because Last of Us Part 2 is the more complex experience, it
Hmm.
makes Last of Us Part 1 in any way lesser than what it was to begin with. It
Yes and no. I would say
well,
because
hold on.
I,
Yeah.
I,
You
present your case and then I'll rebut it if I need to.
because the intent of Last of Us One is not to be anything more than it is.
Of course. Of course.
I mean, I think. Well, let me finish this example, and in that
Yeah.
the Last of Us One sets out to tell a very defined story, and the
Absolutely. Yeah.
writing is impeccable, the pacing is impeccable, the set pieces are impeccable, and all of
Yeah.
them are tied to a very strong narrative emotional core. The
Yeah.
Last of Us One, especially having replayed it in the Part One iteration, is largely flawless. I feel,
Hmm.
and I think that I still very much prefer Part Two,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I think I was totally wrong in my previous assertion that in comparison, Part Two makes it in any way look worse
Sure.
because I don't think that it does. I think those games have different objectives.
Yeah. No. Of
and, and,
course.
and I think probably when I finish Tears of the Kingdom and I really think about it in comparison to Breath of the Wild, it'll probably be the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think it's even more so because while Tears of the Kingdom does have a much stronger narrative than Breath of the Wild, there's no doubt that those are both very mechanics driven games. The Last of Us is obviously very narratively satisfying. That's the appeal. Although I also find the Naughty Dog's gameplay quite good, but because it's so story centric, because the story is so successful, I just don't think that it's made worse because part two is more than. And I also just don't feel like it's accurate to say that the writing of part one is less impactful or thoughtful than part two either.
Mm. Yeah, well, the reason I say I agree and disagree, I think from a sort of like external level, your analysis is absolutely correct. They
Yeah,
are going for different things. They have different context of what they were made, when
yeah,
they what the creators had in mind when they were thinking what they could do with the narrative of video games. But for me, the reason I push back on that a little bit and why I still stand by my thought process on Last of Us One, which again is still one of my favorite games I've ever played,
yeah,
and I don't think that game is worse because I played Part Two, but I think that in terms of what we're talking about expectations being changed. Again, I have not played part one
yeah,
in years, so that absolutely could change, and I think it certainly might when I re-experience it through the PS5 remake that they did. Is that what I loved about The Last of Us One? I think is the world, is the characters, is the moral complexity, all of that. And for me, playing Last of Us Two, it showed me that these things can be done better in ways that it engaged me a lot more. The variety of characters, complexity is not necessarily an inherent superior element,
yeah.
but for me, it absolutely is on a
Sure,
subjective level. I prefer there to be a lot of characters in my games, in my stories. Endgame,
that's fair. Yeah,
Last of Us 2, God of War Ragnarok, these are some of my favorite things of all time because they do ensemble cast in a gigantic way.
yeah,
And they are so complex and moving around. And so when I think about Last of Us 1, I'm like, this is missing the element that makes me now love Last of Us so much, which is 20 fucking characters and a storyline that's complex and playing as multiple
sure.
people that are fighting against one another. That to me is what The Last of Us identity is and why I love that series. And part one doesn't have that element anymore. So in retrospect, on a very subjective experiential level, I think back on Last of Us 1, I'm like, it's missing some of the elements that make me love The Last of Us as I know it, which Part 2 added because it had a different context, because it had a different goal in mind. It changes my expectations. And so Last of Us 1 is not a worse game, but I'm less interested in it because I know what they can do, what they have done with Part 2, with
Sure.
Last of Us 2.
That makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Anything else you want to talk about? Because I feel like I basically run dry.
I think the final example, we don't have to go on this super long, but is what I'm most experienced with in terms of games shifting their opinions over time in the cultural consciousness. I'm going to say it, the P word. Pokemon. Pokemon has a fucking cycle. It has a so clearly defined cycle that it's memed to death on the internet, but it's such an interesting cycle that it's so predictable that you wonder if any opinion at any point in time is like accurate on any of these fucking games.
Right.
Is with Pokemon games, the one that came out 2 generations ago is really lame and it's kind of weird, and the current generation is bad, but once you've given it like 7 or 8 years, oh my god, do you remember what that game did that the current ones aren't doing? And Pokemon was so good back then when it had these elements that the current ones aren't, and it doesn't stop. It happens for every fucking generation. And so each one continues to get reevaluated as, I think more accurately for Pokemon, people who did grow up with those games and are hardcore fans of those games enter that cultural consciousness and bring their perspective to it and are able to say, this is what I loved about Pokemon. Remember what they were doing back then and how much fun that was and how unique and creative and pushing the series forward. And oh man, those current games, they're not doing nothing compared to the older ones. But because it keeps happening and it happens so consistently, I like continue to question what actually matters and what actually people care about in the Pokemon franchise. I think it's fascinating. I think about it constantly.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I also think it's a much more universal idea, even though it's been sort of like coined as the proper noun Pokemon cycle.
Well, I agree.
Because I think it's also very analogous, even though this isn't specifically a games thing, but it's exactly the same for Star Wars.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, absolutely.
The number of people right now who are like, man, you know what's fucking amazing and always has been? The prequels.
Yeah.
And I'm over here saying, brother, you're right. They were always amazing.
Yeah.
But I never changed my opinion.
Yeah.
But there's no doubt that in these sort of fandoms of immense scale that pump out a lot of media, that people are always frankly discontented with the newest thing because the older thing coincided with something in their life that was meaningful or whatever.
Yep.
I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that Pokemon X is my favorite because it came out when I had just changed schools and I made a lot of new friends off of the back of that, and I kept in touch with people in my old school because of it, right? I mean, that's ultimately why it's my favorite.
Yeah.
Pokemon is so, and as I've become more cynical, I've become more and more like whatever. It's been kind of true the whole time. It is so samey every time.
Yeah, absolutely.
That I really don't feel like anybody has a leg to stand on in saying that my game is objectively better than your game.
I 100% agree.
100% agree. For the most part. And so it's like, it's obvious that there's another factor here. Yeah. And I think it speaks to, and I think it's a great point to end it on, actually, of Tucker.
Oh, he's going to grab something. Run across the room, the lighting's changing, he's standing, and he's back. Oh, he's not grabbing anything. He's just doing a comedic bit. This is physical comedy, ladies and gentlemen.
You know what it boils
Buster Keaton of our age.
You know what it boils down to?
Oh! The nature of perspective, baby. Let's fucking go. Let's goddamn go.
But Tucker, I think this has been a very fruitful conversation.
Absolutely. And I hope that you guys were able to glean something from this. Think about like other examples in your life. I mean, not many of you submitted, and frankly, that's
cringe.
On you. And like cringe, lame, bad.
Cringe.
But we're not.
Hello,
because we did an hour-long
department.
Conversation. Ring-a-ding-ding, BLB community. But we will have more of these conversations in the future, of course. We also want this to exist in perpetuity as a catalyst for conversation.
Right.
Leave comments down below, please. For the love of God, for the love of the algorithm, leave comments down below about games that you've changed your opinions on, or games that you know that other people have changed their opinions on. Like us talking about DMC, like we know that people have changed their opinion on it, but like, yeah, we don't give a fuck about that game. And also join a Discord where you can continue to have these conversations. If you just like copy the link and you're like, hey, you guys remember this video? This will be like 4 years time, I assume. You like, remember this video? I had this thought when I was watching it. It would be like, shwing, would be teleported back in time. But I do remember that video, and boom, here's my response to your response.
Just a little sneak peek. The next topic will be our games too woke now. So let us know in the comments section.
Oh,
Are video games too woke?
yeah, yeah, that's gonna age perfectly. Yeah, political opinions.
Yeah, that's
Boom.
what we're doing next, right?
Yeah,
Right? Leave your comments, guys. We'll read
back
them.
liberal banter.
We'll read them for the video we're doing, guys. Leave them.